Unit 3 is all going to be about how land-based empires expanded and then legitimized and consolidated their power. Legitimacy, so we don't forget, is commonly defined in political science as the belief that a rule, institution, or leader has the right to govern. States throughout AP world history want to legitimize their power because they don't want to be overthrown. Specifically, the governments of states want to legitimize their power. One way to legitimize power is through use of religion. Consolidating deals with strengthening one's hold on power, and one usually does that. States usually do that through bureaucracies, taxes, and maybe coercive technologies such as gunpowder, guns, weapons, etc. So here's the big context of this unit. So the fall of the Mongol Khanates, so the Mongol kingdoms, combined with the spread of gunpowder from China, allowed the gunpowder empires of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, all Islamic states, and the Russian empires to expand and grow in the period of 1450 to 1750. Although the gunpowder empires were highly militaristic, meaning they venerated military force as a means of achieving goals, they also left long-standing cultural legacies and architectural achievements. We're going to get more into developments in Europe in Unit 4. So for now, just know that around 1450s, European states start to exit the feudal system and start developing early modern states with large central governments, etc., or expanding central governments, I should say. They're not very large yet. Russia, in contrast, I'm going to talk about for quite a while, so bear with me. So just some context. When the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire fell, the center of Orthodox Christianity moved northward to Moscow in Russia, and it was often called the Third Rome. At around the same time, Russian leaders were overthrowing the Mongols. In 1480, Ivan III, who's not listed here, of Moscow refused to pay tribute to the Mongols and declared Russia free of Mongol rule. He and later his grandson Ivan IV established absolute rule in Russia, uniting it and expanding it ever eastward. They recruited peasants and offered them freedom from their feudal lords if they agreed to settle in the new lands to the east. The catch was that these peasants had to conquer the land themselves. Known as Cossacks, these peasant soldiers expanded Russian territories in the 16th through the 18th century well into Siberia and southward to the Caspian Sea. Ivan IV was such a strong leader and held such absolute power that he became known as Ivan the Terrible, not necessarily meaning bad, but instead formidable or impressive. Taking on the title of Tsar, Russian for Caesar, Ivan the Terrible expanded Russia's holdings, but not without the cost to the Russian people. By the 1560s, he ruled under a reign of terror, regularly executing anyone whom he perceived as a threat to his power, including his own son, executed in 1580. Again, we're going to talk about more about developments in Europe in Unit 4, but for right now, we're just going to talk briefly about centralizing power in European monarchies. So during the High Middle Ages and through the Renaissance and Counter-Reformation, the Church allied itself with strong monarchs. These monarchs came to power by centralizing authority, uniting people under a common banner, and forming empires by promoting exploration and colonization. We'll talk more about that later, and ruling with absolute authority. Because the vast majority of their population were Christian, the best way to rule was to align oneself with God. Monarchs became convinced that God had ordained their right to govern, and that meant that people had a moral and religious obligation to obey them. This concept was known as the divine right of monarchs. James I of England, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, summed it up this way: the king is from God and the law is from the king. So back to Ivan IV. Remember, Ivan IV was all about centralizing power in his hands, and he was very fearful of the Russian nobles called the boyars. After the death of Ivan IV in 1584, and with no strong heir to take the throne, Russia's feudal lords continually battled over who should rule the empire. The situation grew especially messy from 1604 to 1613, a period that historians refer to as the Time of Troubles, because one pretender to the throne would be killed by another pretender and yet another. In 1613, the madness subsided with Michael Romanov was elected Tsar by the feudal lords. The Romanov dynasty added stability to the empire. It ruled until 1917. The Romanovs consolidated power and often ruled ruthlessly like the Ivans. the Romanovs continued the policy of expanding the empire with the Cossacks, and by 1689, Russian territory spread from the Ukraine to the Pacific Ocean north of Manchuria. Peter the Great, who was a czar under the Romanov dynasty from 1682 through 1725, came to power. He was convinced of the need to westernize Russia. He built Russia's first navy and founded St. Petersburg at the Baltic Sea as his new capital. St. Petersburg became the home to hundreds of Western European engineers, scientists, architects, and artists who were recruited specifically to westernize Russia. Under Peter the Great, a common thread for the consolidation of power, Peter the Great used a bureaucracy to collect taxes and to run the government. Under the Russian state, peasants were taxed heavily and pushed further into serfdom. Since the AP test will be a DBQ, we're going to be doing a lot of source analysis and writing over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be sourcing the following document to support the argument / the topic sentence. Russia used religion and the Cossacks to expand and maintain power. Remember, source analysis is not a checklist, right? You're not looking for every letter of soap per se. In fact, I recommend that if you find one good letter of soap, then you use that one. I think talking about the audience of this document might be particularly helpful, but that's just me. Source analysis at the end of the day is trying to do one thing. It's trying to analyze a document, either discuss the point of view, the historical context, or the purpose of a document to either make that document more credible if it's supportive of your argument, or less credible if it's not supportive of your argument. Also, maybe just to modify an argument or add some kind of nuance or complexity to it. The formula for SOAP analysis or sourcing a document is actually in the right-hand corner, so you can see what you need to add in the space provided, in the lines provided, and also I want you to start integrating outside evidence beyond that found in the document. So you could talk about the Cossacks, you could talk about maybe a specific date and a specific figure that is relevant to the document of some sort. We'll discuss this in writing sections further. But you will get points for integrating outside specific historical evidence outside of the documents you are given. So now we're going to switch over to developments in China. So by 1368, the Ming Dynasty comes to power. They overthrow the Mongol Yuan Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty comes to power, and they begin consolidating their power. So the Ming build a strong central government and based on Confucian principles. They reinstalled a civil service examination system, which we had talked about at length as being one of the reasons China had such a well-educated and expansive bureaucratic system. And they removed Mongol influence by reinvigorating Chinese culture. So the Ming Dynasty is a period of reassertion of governmental control, reinvigorating Chinese culture, reinstalling Confucian principles. So their government is definitely legitimated and consolidated with Confucianism, the bureaucracy, etc. We've talked about the Zheng-He treasure fleet at length. So in the early 15th century, the Chinese also did something quite extraordinary. They built huge fleets. Zheng-He, a Chinese navigator, led fleets throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean all the way to East Africa a century before the Europeans did the same. Had the Chinese continued to explore and trade, they may have become the dominant colonial power instead of Europeans, but instead they turned inward and they adopted an isolationist policy. So history might have been written very differently had they made different decisions. So the Ming Dynasty declined and it was eventually replaced by the Manchus or the Qing Dynasty. But the Ming Dynasty declined because of inflation. So the Ming government was trying to replace or standardize its currency based on silver. As they were getting more and more supplies and the supply of silver increased, however, inflation took hold, right? Because then the currency depreciated in value, so goods and services started to cost more, and then runaway inflation just got out of hand and caused all kinds of economic issues. So the Qing come to power in 1644, and they stay in power in China until 1911. So remember the dynasty song. One Min Qing Republic, One Min Qing Republic, Now Zedong, Now Zedong. Because the Qing dynasty were from Manchuria, they were not ethnically Chinese. They attempted to remain an ethnic elite, however, so they forbid the Chinese from learning the Manchu language or to marry Manchus. However, because the Manchus comprised only 3% of the population, they needed the help of ethnic Chinese to run the country. Therefore, the civil service examination gained new status. Even members of lower classes were able to rise to positions of responsibility as the Manchus opened up the floodgates to find the best talent. So that here again you can see the importance of the imperial bureaucracy. Manchu emperors were well steeped in Chinese traditions. Both Kangxi, who ruled from 1661 to 1722, and his chief successor Xinlong, who ruled from 1735 to 1796, were Confucian scholars. Both emperors not only supported the arts but also expanded the empire. Kangxi conquered Taiwan and extended the empire into Mongolia, Central Asia, and Tibet. Qingyunlong added Vietnam, Burma, and Nepal to the vassal states of China. In all this expansion, the Chinese did not aspire to conquer the rest of the world or even interact with it very much. They stayed focused on China and its surrounding neighbors. The Manchus did trade with the Europeans and granted rights to the Portuguese, Dutch, and British, but they were vigilant about and successful at controlling trade relations through the mid-18th century. The Manchu were fierce protectors of their culture. When they felt threatened by European advances, they expelled the Europeans. In 1724, for example, Christianity was banned, and in 1757, trade was restricted to just one city, Canton. Still, trade with Europeans was substantial. The Europeans bought large quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain. In exchange, the merchants received huge sums of silver, which created a new rising class of merchants in the Chinese coastal cities and led to corruption of the bureaucracy. So here you can see how both the Qing and the Ming Dynasty consolidated power and centralized power in China. Here's the other independent practice that you have to turn in for Tuesday. Again, you're doing the same thing, sourcing the document and then providing a piece of historical and specific evidence to support the topic sentence. So you could use a variety of letters of soap. You don't only have to use one. So if you're talking about the speaker of the document, the Ming Emperor obviously has a lot of authority. Tell me why that matters and why that relates to supporting the argument or making your argument more complex. Or you can also talk about the occasion. You can talk about the circumstances of the Yuan dynasty's decline, etc. And how maybe the Ming Emperor is trying to put the Ming Dynasty in contrast to the Yuan Dynasty, and then explain how that supports or relates to your topic, sentence, or argument. Remember, you're trying to relate everything to that topic, sentence, or argument. Nothing should be disjointed. And then you can provide an additional piece of historical evidence. So you could talk about how the Ming Dynasty reinstated the civil service exam, or built a strong central government based on Confucian principles, or removed Mongol influence by reinvigorating Chinese culture. It's really up to you. When we're talking about the Islamic gunpowder empires, we're talking about the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. Gunpowder empires were able to expand because they had very strong militaries, and the empires were replacing very weak and corrupt, and Europe was busy fighting itself. Some context about the Ottoman Empire. So as the Mongol Empire fell in the last two units, the Muslim Ottoman Empire founded by Osman Bey rose in Anatolia, which is now present-day Turkey, to unify the region and challenge the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Christian Empire. As it grew in the 14th century, the Turks, as the Ottomans were called, came to dominate most of modern-day Turkey, and eventually in 1453 they invaded Constantinople itself, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, thereby ending the Byzantine Empire. So Mehmed II was the conqueror of Constantinople, which is a great feat. And then Suleiman I, he's often called Suleiman the Magnificent. That's when the Ottoman Empire peaks. They expand deeply into Europe. In the expanding empire, Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their religions, making the empire more tolerant than both the previous Islamic Empire and the other major regimes of the era. What really allows the Ottoman Empire to expand is simple: guns and gunpowder, cannons. Suleiman the Magnificent seems poised to take all of Europe. He lays siege to Vienna, Austria in 1529, but they just don't take it. If they probably would have taken it, then the history of the world would have been completely different, as the Ottoman Empire would have likely have had a great effect on European politics and society and culture. To conquer large territories, the Ottomans enslaved children of their Christian subjects and turned them into fighting warriors, known as janissaries. Christian boys were also part of the Doveshirmer system, and they, retained government positions in the bureaucracy. So, kind of, um, I wouldn't say weird, but definitely eccentric way of centralizing power and creating a bureaucracy. The Ottomans, for example, remade Constantinople their capital, renamed it Istanbul, and converted the great cathedrals such as the Hagia Sophia into mosques. Taxes. So we've done this source analysis before. So you could talk about the speaker, Suleiman the Magnificent. You could talk about the occasion, which is in a time of Ottoman expansions into Europe, or you can talk about the purpose, which is basically to flex, to say I'm a bad bee, etc. So read the slide. It's not likely that you'll be touched on the Safavids, but it's worth mentioning that the chief rivals of the Ottomans were their eastern neighbors, the Safavids. The centralized state was based on military conquest and dominated by Shia Islam. Its location between the Ottomans and the Mughal empires in what is present-day Iran resulted in often contentious relationships between Muslim states, alliances with European nations against the Ottomans, and a continuation of long-standing rift between the Sunni and Shia sects. The Mughal Empire was distinctive for several reasons. First, within about 150 years, it had almost united the entire subcontinent, something that had previously been done to the same extent. Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, was able to unify much of India by governing under a policy of religious toleration. He allowed Hinduism and Islam to be practiced openly. He eliminated the jizya, the head tax on Hindus that had been a source of great anger to the people, and tried to improve the position of women by attempting to eliminate sati, the practice in which high caste Hindu women would throw themselves onto their husbands' funeral pyres. Despite Islam being a relatively egalitarian religion, the caste system in India actually strengthens. This is definitely an example of syncretism, so go back to the Unit 1 and Unit 2 YouTube video if you don't remember what the definition is. The grandson of Akbar builds beautiful monumental architecture like the Taj Mahal. One of the big reasons for the decline of the Mughal Empire was that religious toleration ended. A very proud Muslim comes to power and is not very tolerant of Hindus. He wages wars of expansion that are just not very, that require increased taxation and are just economically problematic. The second reason is contact with Europeans. We'll discuss both the expansion of Europeans into India and the decline of the Mughal Empire at length in later units. For now, let's stick to the happy times of the Mughal Empire. So they extended Akbar extended Mughal borders. Capable men came to serve him after learning of his brilliance, and he created a very strong centralized government. The bureaucratic elites, called zamindars, were in charge of specific duties like taxation. They were paid by being allowed to keep some of the taxes they collected. Taxes. So in the 16th century, a series of shoguns continued to rule Japan. So think of Japan as the people with the real power and the emperor as the person with the ceremonial power. For example, the Queen Elizabeth today only has ceremonial power, and the real power is vested in the prime minister. Also, I forgot to mention sultans when we talked about Suleiman, etc. Sultans are like leaders of an Islamic caliphate. The sultans had a vizier, Vizier, that was very much like a shogun. So Japan's feudal system kind of starts to wane, and more centralized power comes into being, and it coincides with Japanese exposure to the West. Japan switched gears under the Tokugawa shogunate, named after Tokugawa. He's a shogun that is very fearful, or not fearful, but skeptical of European exploration. Tokugawa further consolidates power away from feudal lords and into himself. The Edo period, or also called the Tokugawa shogunate period, is from 1600 to 1868, and it's basically describes a period where there's huge reversal in attitudes towards Western influences. One such story of Tokugawa's fearfulness of Western influence was in 1640. A group of Portuguese diplomats and traders sailed to Japan to try to negotiate with the emperor and convince him to open up a dialogue. The shogun had every member of the Portuguese delegation executed on the spot. The message was clear: Japan was off limits. The absence of foreign influences allowed Japanese culture to thrive. During the time period, Buddhism and Shintoism remained at the center of the culture, and unique Japanese art forms also prospered. Haiku became very popular during this period, for examples. Please read how the Tokugawa shogunate consolidates power. Here's another independent practice that you're required to do, and it's due by Wednesday by midnight. So source the following document. In the occasion, you could talk about, how there's a shift in attitudes and a fear by the Tokugawa shogunate against Western influences. You could talk about the speaker too. It's coming from a position of a lot of authority, etc. So there's so many different avenues that you could take with this one, and we'll be definitely discussing about it in discussion sections. So we're going to talk about religion a lot more next week when we get into Unit 4, but right now religion has always been a unifier and divider in some sense, and so it was definitely in this period as well. One such example was the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation divides Europe between Protestants and Catholics. So the Catholic Church has grown political power exponentially well into the 1500s. And Martin Luther, who is mad at the corruption of the church, in particular the sale of indulgences, which guarantee people the right into heaven, nails 95 theses to a door, kickstarts the Protestant Reformation, and you can read this slide here. Counter-Reformation is the Catholic Church's response. Read the slide. The Protestant Reformation led to all kinds of wars in Europe. Read the slide. A schism is a breaking apart. We also talked about Islamic religious schisms between the Sunni and the Shias, and those are the differences between the Sunnis and the Shias. And that schism plays out in the interactions between the Islamic land-based empires that we discussed. This is a preview of what we'll talk about next week. So this is your final assignment. It's due Thursday by midnight. Please turn it in. It's the closest thing that you're going to come to what your AP test is actually going to look like. Your AP test is only going to be 5 documents of a document-based question. So I only put 5 documents. The rubric is a little different. It's out of 10 points, but basically what I want you to do is make sure you use at least 4 documents to support an argument. That argument should be rooted in your thesis. Make sure that you have a thesis, that you have a contextualization paragraph, that you use 2 specific pieces of outside information, and that you source at least 2 documents. That will give you a 100 and a 5 on the AP exam.